Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure, honor, and privilege to be invited to be able to share my thoughts with you. Shri Ram Madhavji, the Governing Council and the Board of Trustees of the India Foundation have put together such a thoughtful program over the next 2 days. Not only the choice of topics, but the choice of speakers, the panelists, etc., convey meticulous planning and preparation, and not to leave out foresight as well. This particular session mentions the theme as Economics 2.0, and if I may borrow from the subtitle of the overall theme, Rebooting to Meta Era. To some extent, I wish Junaid's technology connection had remained in limbo until I finished speaking, for the simple reason that most of our thoughts overlapped. So, to a large extent, I will be echoing some of the important points that he made. The conflict that has broken out in Ukraine is a reminder that technology is at best a source of partial answers to the challenges that we face. And the kind of turmoil and volatility we are witnessing in the stock market, or for that matter, the craze with which people invest in crypto assets or stable coins backed by crypto assets, both of which have no cash flows to speak of, is a reminder that humans are still driven by fear and greed, and sometimes technology probably accentuates them rather than eliminate them. Just before coming to this hall, I read an article, a fairly long one by Professor Jonathan Haidt at the Stern School of Business, and his well-known book is The Righteous Mind. And this article that appeared in The Atlantic talks about how the last decade has been a uniquely stupid one for America. This is a fairly long article, but I would recommend that you read it, because one of the contributors for the stupidity that he discusses in this article is attributed to the company that has renamed itself as Meta. So therefore, what I'm going to talk to you about today is that while certainly we need to celebrate the progress that India has made in the last several years and will be making in the next several years or decades in terms of harnessing technology to deliver growth, prosperity, and a higher standard of living to millions of Indians, that can be achieved provided we address some of the issues that Junaid talked about, which I will be sharing with you. When I first saw the subtitle of this particular session given to me, I thought Economy 2.0 meant that we had a pre-pandemic and a post-pandemic economy. That I would have thought was somewhat of an oversimplification, because the Indian economy has indeed gone through multiple transitions in the last 70 years or so. We can think of the economy that we had post-Avadi resolution in the 1950s, industrial policy resolution, as economy 1.0. And then the decade of the 80s heralded the first wave or whiff of liberalization, starting from the leadership of the Finance Minister R. Venkatraman in the early 80s, and we can call it Economy 1.5. Then in 1991, of course, we had a slightly more massive liberalization, mostly of the external economy and the financial sector and product markets. And that, of course, definitely qualifies as economy 2.0 because that really marked a major significant shift between before 90 and after 90. Then in 2004, we had a new government, and that government focused on enacting many social entitlement schemes and packaged them as empowerment, as constitutional rights, right to food, right to education, right to employment guarantee in rural India, etc. And that is economy 2.5. In 2014, the NDA government came to office, and this government made an attempt to reform the factor markets. The first wave of reforms in 1991 was focused on product markets and the financial markets. But factor markets are more difficult, land and labor. Capital market reforms done in the early 90s were relatively easier. There was a focus on factor market reforms, and there was also a belief in the formalization of the economy. And that we are seeing a continuation of that in 2019 as well, because formalization opens the doors of finance and therefore open the doors for small, micro, medium enterprises, as well as the informal workers, the pathway to growth. Because formalization means access to finance. So reform of the factor markets and formalization of the economy, I would say, marked economy 3.0 actually. And then came from 2015-16 onwards, these harnessing of the public digital goods, starting with Aadhaar, and then universal banking through Jan Dhan Yojana, and then we had the implementation of the goods and services tax, and now lately the unified payment system, and then now the pilot launch of the open network digital commerce, and then the development of the CoWIN app, etc., are taking technology to a different level. Unlike in the United States, where technologies were developed by the private sector, and therefore the fruits of those technologies in terms of profits stayed in the hands of few entrepreneurs or few shareholders. In India, these technological backbone and the foundations have been developed as public digital goods, on top of which private apps have been developed. In that sense, India's digital goods reform or digital goods platform actually constitutes, in my opinion, economy 4.0. So, right now, as we are entering hopefully into the post-pandemic era, the Indian economy is poised for its 4th edition, and how that is going to play out in terms of shaping the future of this country over the next 25 years by the time we reach 100. And what the magazine Economist has done recently, even though it only could come up with a grudging praise, it did outline a certain element of how this Indian economy will shape up, the 2.0 as you put it, or 4.0 as I put it. What they write is, as the pandemic recedes, 4 pillars are clearly visible that will support growth in the next decade or decades. The forging of a single national market, thanks to the goods and services tax, an expansion of industry owing to the renewable energy shift, and a move in supply chains away from China, continued preeminence in information technology, and a high-tech welfare safety net for the hundreds of millions left behind by all of these. So the Economist magazine has identified in its own way the elements that would constitute the next 25 years of the Indian economy: single market, technology and renewable energy shift, expansion of industry, and is a welfare safety net which is enabled and facilitated by technology in terms of delivering the maximum possible benefit without leakages to the most direct beneficiary, rather than being lost in transit. But will that be enough? Will that be enough? The answer is no. There is more, and Junaid to some extent identified a few of them. He spoke about governance, he spoke about state capability, he spoke about state capacity, etc. What I'm going to mention are some additional points to what he said. To deliver the kind of growth rate that would take us to a state of a middle income economy in the next 20 years from where we are a low income country, we have to have a vibrant financial sector. A sector that is capable of providing the funds that are required for development. And thankfully, in that sense, we had gone through a difficult phase in the last decade. The banking system had overlent, the corporate sector had overborrowed, and we spent the bulk of the last decade cleaning up balance sheets everywhere, in the financial system and in the corporate system. That is why, in this decade, as central banks around the world tighten monetary policy, India is better placed than most countries because we have paid our share of growth dues in the last decade, because the financial sector was rebuilding. So it is in a position to deliver domestically driven growth. That is one important thing. Then, on top of that, even as the pandemic was unfolding in the last 2 years, the government, as is to be expected, used the crisis as an opportunity to deliver many structural reforms, particularly industrial policy in terms of the production-linked incentive schemes, the reduction in corporate tax rates, and rules concerning startups and businesses were simplified, retrospective taxation ended, and after a gap of more than 20 years, India has re-embarked on privatization. And that should be kept in mind. Privatization has not been attempted in the last 2 decades, and therefore the privatization of Air India was not just a milestone exercise, but it is an important paradigm shift after a 2-decade gap. And then the asset monetization scheme, which basically improves the balance sheet of the government. So as we retire assets, as we pass them on to private hands, we will also be able to extinguish government liabilities, bring down debt ratios, bring down the cost of capital for the private sector. So it's very important that we focus on fiscal prudence and fiscal sustainability. This is not about Washington economics. This is actually about Indian middle-class economics. In order to have a sustainable finances for the households and for the government. Therefore, the important thing as we go into this next decade or the next quarter century, what I call as economics 2.0 is all about responsible economics on the part of all systems of governments, union, state and local governments, and also for the private sector. So with respect to the government, there are 5 elements, and I'm not talking about the union government alone here, I'm talking about all systems of governance across all levels, state, local and union. One, as I mentioned, fiscal prudence. The other elements of this responsible economics would be, because there is no technology without power sector. Therefore, reforming the power sector, making sure that the DISCOMs are viable, making sure that we do not have to worry about availability of coal as raw material for power generation in the next summer, etc., because climate change is going to be with us. That will be the second element of responsible economics. The third element, in general, governments as a litigant. In the budget of 22-23, the finance minister said the government will not file new cases when a pending case is similar to the one that the government wants to file as a new case. That should be extended across all levels of government. The government as a litigant should be the last resort. And we should not forget, as we speak of the meta-economy or a meta-society, in the last 2 years, education at the school level has been very badly undermined by the frequent lockdowns and shutdowns of educational institutions. And anecdotally, what I hear from different school leaderships across the country is that students are now displaying attention deficiency, their social skills have been impaired, so there is likely to be a medium-term impact of this in terms of their ability to learn new skills, to be able to be productive, etc. And therefore, focusing on making up the last 2 years of lost education will also be an important element of this responsible economics. Lastly, I would say, responsible economics is not just about the public sector or the government. Responsible economics, which is economics 2.0 or 4.0, is also about the private sector. The Indian private sector invests very little in terms of research and development. And that is a key if we have to become a meta-economy in the next 25 years. Manufacturing complexity has to increase, and for that, the Indian private sector has to do much more than simply do tinkering, but has to invest in basic and fundamental research. And for that, it has to shed its myopia and think for the long term. Attitude towards public health. If you look at the kind of advertisements you see when you watch IPL matches, whether it is for online gaming or whether it is for junk food, this has implications for India's health. If you look at the National Family Health Survey number 5 that came out in December 2021, the obesity levels of Indian adults in urban or rural India is concerning. It used to be said about China that China would become gray before it became rich. In the case of India, I don't want it to be a situation where India becomes unhealthy before it becomes rich. So, and there the role of the private sector is to ensure that food labeling, warning the public of what they are consuming, is very important. The private sector is actually stalling for the last 5 years food labeling in terms of the junk food that is being sold to the Indian public. Third, the private sector must ensure that it pays small, micro, and medium enterprises on time. And that is something that has been missing in action, because access to finance is not just about providing bank loans, but about making sure that we pay them on time so that they can grow as well. So, I would just like to leave you all with one message. Whatever we prioritize, the near-term desires and demand that our wishes be met, whenever we put ourselves in the center, when we are talking of short-term demands, we should remember whether it is lower taxes or whether it is duty reductions or more subsidies or more reservations or more write-offs of loans, etc. We should remember that we are not hurting someone else or some other outsiders or the government, but we are hurting the future of our own children and grandchildren. So to me, Economics 2.0 or meta thinking is about responsible economics. It is responsible public policy and responsible private behavior. Technology will just be an icing on the cake for this. Thank you very much.